It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back. I'm Doug Blackman. Our guest in this episode of American Forum is Cokie Roberts, the legendary political commentator for National Public Radio and ABC News, and the author of several best-selling books exploring the history of women and power in our national politics, including most recently, Capital Dames, The Civil War and the Women of Washington. The narrative of the Civil War is usually written through political and physical battles waged between men, an extraordinary president versus the flawed leader of a slaveholders' rebellion, congressional speeches, larger-than-life generals on horseback, vast armies arrayed against each other on fields of mud. Yet Cokie Roberts says that great struggle also elevated to prominence, despite the extraordinary 19th century social constraints on their gender, a group of remarkable women who, during the nation's deepest divide, channeled their intelligence, charm, and social positions into unprecedented influence over national politics and policy. In this episode, we're going to explore that history and also how it relates to our current politics, the divisions of today, and the two women who this year are very prominent on the national stage. It's good to see you again.
Great to be with you, Doug.
You've written a book about the role of women in this period of great division in American life when great changes were happening around those women. Many changes yet to come, and now we're in another contemporary political time when women are more important perhaps than ever, certainly in the presidential campaign, also a period of great division. Is there anything to say about the 150 years that have passed between that one great surge of women's roles in Washington and what's happening now?
The political women, who had always been influential from Martha Washington on, were extremely influential in this period. One of the things that I can never get over as I'm reading their letters and reading the newspapers of the time and all of that is how they just march into the White House, whomever is president, and just tell the president what they think and what he should be doing. And I'm so jealous, I can't tell you. I mean, it is fabulous how they do that. But this was an extraordinary period, certainly, and it involved women flowing into the city in a way that had not been true before. Women started to show up in Washington when their husbands or the men in their lives went off to war because they needed to make a living. And so they happened to arrive pretty much about the same time as the Congress passed legislation allowing for the printing of greenbacks to pay for the war. And so they flowed into the Treasury, where the Treasurer of the United States, General Skinner, was eager to hire them, because then, as now, the currency comes off the presses in these great big sheets of bills, and then of course now machines cut them up into individual bills. Then it required somebody sitting with a pair of scissors and cutting them out bill by bill by bill. And Skinner said women are just better with scissors than men are. And he did, and he also allowed us how, of course, he could pay them less. But nothing's changed under that situation, I'm sorry to say. But so there were people taking on new roles in terms of their own employment, and you certainly saw that with the women in the nursing corps, for instance. There really weren't female nurses before the war, with the exception of Catholic nuns. And Dorothea Dix, who was a remarkable woman, she had been there before the war as a lobbyist, and so influential as a lobbyist that the Senate had given her her own little office in the Capitol from which to lobby on behalf of the mentally ill and the poor. And she came to town and set up, told the Surgeon General that she would be the superintendent of female nurses. There were no female nurses, but she managed to recruit them. Then Mary Walker, who was a surgeon, did come to town and volunteer. Well, actually, she wanted to be hired by the Union Army. They wouldn't hire her. She dressed like a man, for which she would get arrested occasionally. But she then was volunteered, and then she did go basically as a contract worker. And had such a horrendous series of experiences that she was awarded the Medal of Honor, and she is still to this day, in 2015, the only woman to have received the Medal of Honor. So somebody like Virginia Clay, who as a Southerner was really a refugee through most of the war, by the end of the war had become someone who was ready to stand on a public platform and make speeches. And she had sort of joked about the suffragists before the war, and she then became an ardent suffragist herself, and stood there with Horace Greeley, someone her husband had, of course, fought bitterly before the war. And she took on this role of a public spokesperson for a cause.
And the anecdote that you mentioned just a moment ago of these jobs being given to women to cut up the dollar bills as they're coming off the presses, that's also an anecdote of where after those women are hired, there are then these allegations of scandal, or people are saying that, oh, this is just where the men are having their girlfriends
Well, there was a certain amount of that because the Congress got to hire.
And men will be men. That gets at, though, the tension that so many of these women had to navigate between both exercising this greater degree of influence but at the same time not appearing to be ambitious, this bad word for a woman.
Well, Clara Barton, for instance, who is a big character in this book because there's no avoiding it. You know, one of the things that drives me completely nuts about history books, many things drive me completely nuts about history books, but is that they'll say something like, Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross. End of story, right? You know, really, was it hard? Was there any effort involved in that? You know,
any difficulty?
But of course, her story is quite remarkable. She grew up in Massachusetts, the daughter of an abolitionist and suffragist mother, and always railed against the fact that she was making less than men as a teacher and would not take jobs if men were getting paid more and all that. She finally comes to Washington, gets a job in the patent office, where for a while she was paid as much as men. But then when the war broke out and she started to see that soldiers were in need of supplies, she got things for the Massachusetts soldiers who were bivouacked in the Senate chamber. And they started writing home and saying, this woman can get anything. And so everything started flowing to her. And when she had 3 warehouses full of supplies, she went to the quartermaster general, who sent her to the front, and which is where she wanted to be. She was worried about going to the front, that it would be seen as an improper woman. And she talked to her father about it, of all people. He was dying. And he said, not only will you be respected because you are a respectable woman, but if you don't go, you will not be doing your duty. So she not only had permission, she had a charge to go forward. So, but that kind of worry was there internally, and of course externally. There were people who ridiculed these women or tried to harass them in various ways, absolutely. And so then throughout the war, she nursed and she provided supplies for the soldiers. And then when the war was over, she established the Missing Persons Bureau. It was one of the last things that Lincoln did, was to say that, that people should apply to her to find missing soldiers. And so she answered 63,000 letters, I think, and identified tens of thousands of soldiers, and marked in Andersonville more than 10,000 graves, so that people had the dignity and respect of being known soldiers, not unknown soldiers. And then she did go to Europe and found out about the Red Cross, and founded the American Red Cross. And then at the end of the war, when Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife, who you described as a flawed character, and that's to say the least, the marriage was an uncomfortable marriage. He finally died, and she moved to New York to work as a journalist, and she wanted to move to New York. She needed the money. He didn't have any money. And she wanted the job, and there was this huge outcry in the South. How could the First Lady of the Confederacy, go to New York City? And she had always been too olive-complected to be the perfect Southern belle. And she was suspect. Her grandfather had been the governor of New Jersey and all that. And so she wrote to her daughter when she's getting all this heat and all this resistance, and a lot of it was from women. And she says, "I am free, brown, and 62. I can go wherever I want to go."
Down in the South, you also have a phenomenon of women taking on big leadership roles in all of the post-Civil War memorial associations. And they're these big national organizations of women that grow up out of this, the creating of this mythology about the Confederacy.
Well, except some of that at the beginning, some of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the building of memorials and all of that was meant to be reconciliation. And these women really did do a lot of things by way of reconciliation. I mean, I talked about Virginia Clay with Horace Greeley. Verena Davis befriended Julia Grant, and it was on page 1 of every newspaper in the country when the two of them met. And
that's General Ulysses Grant's
Yes, the
wife.
general who defeated her husband. And she then went to the dedication of the Grant Memorial, very much understanding that what she was doing was reconciliation. And one of the women who was very involved with the Confederacy was the United Daughters of the Confederacy and all that, was a woman named Sarah Pryor, whose husband Roger Pryor was from Virginia in Congress and a newspaper man as well. And he had been this hot-headed secessionist. He had pushed for Sumter to happen, all of that. After the war, ends up as a judge in New York, go figure. And she was a very prominent writer and a journalist. And she was deeply involved in organizations that would bring about reconciliations. It got much worse in the 20th century, all of those organizations, than they were originally started out being in the late 19th century.
So many of them began actually just with the terrible problem of on the battlefields of the South, there were bodies all over the place and getting them properly buried. And it is extraordinary that we've gone from that to the Confederate flag debate of today. Yeah.
You and I were talking earlier about you growing up in Mississippi, me in Louisiana. I had frankly never wanted to write a Civil War book, partly because all of my ancestors who fought, and most of them did fight, all fought on the losing side. So it is not, this is not hostile territory to me at all. This is my homeland.
Oh, same for me. Yeah, I'm eligible to be a member of the Sons of, of Confederate Veterans. But also, and I've talked about it on this show and a few other circumstances. Frankly, I'm, I really say this in a deliberate way. I'm just so thankful that the Army of Northern Virginia, with Morris Fauché, my great-great-grandfather, I'm so thankful that they did so badly at Pickett's Charge and that the Army of Northern Virginia was destroyed.
My great-great-uncle surrendered 6 weeks after Appomattox. Well,
you got to give him a little credit for that.
The Army of the Trans-Mississippi. We were at Fort Sumter with my grandchildren not too long ago, and the youngest boy in one family was of course in the souvenir shop, and he says to his mother, my daughter, "So what side are we on?" He wanted to know, which hat to buy, and she said, well, all of our family who was alive at the time fought for the South, but it was good that the North won. And I think that's right.
Yeah, well, and I went through a similar process with my children, of actually making sure that they knew that. That's also why I call it a slaveholders' rebellion. I mean, I actually think that's the most accurate way to describe the war.
It was also, though, such a failure of politics, and that's what makes me crazy when I was doing the work. I mean, I had not wanted to do a Civil War book because of that. I mean, we're talking about 600,000 plus American dead. And it's because the Congress couldn't get its act together in order to free the slaves. And that is a real condemnation of politics.
Yeah, and it speaks to the vulnerability of a great democracy, that
Right.
even an emerging great democracy can go so far awry. I mean, so that takes us into the present.
Right. There we are.
There we are. Now, that's not to suggest that we're about to erupt into civil war in the United States.
Because we do not have a moral issue like slavery, thank God. Because did we, I don't know where we'd end up.
In terms of the role that women play, or spouses play in Washington now and in national politics, on the one hand, some of the roles that you talk about here, and the wives using their social positions, and then the diplomacy of the parties and the bells and all that. In some respects, that feels like this old-fashioned kind of behavior that we're supposed to frown on in a way. That this was the role of women. On the other hand, you can look at Washington today, and we often talk about that congressmen don't know each other as well as they once did, like your father knew the other congressman that he served with. And we wish there was more of that back in Washington again. But what about the spousal side? Has that part of the ritual disappeared as well?
Pretty much. And it is mainly because the families are not there. One of the things we haven't mentioned, or people we haven't mentioned here, is my mother. One of the most remarkable people of all time, who I saw operating with the other congressional wives, running everything when I was growing up. You know, they ran all the political conventions, they ran all the voter registration drives, they ran their husbands' campaigns, they often ran their husbands' offices. Of course, they ran us kids. And it was before home rule in Washington. They worked with the African American women in Washington, running all the social service agencies. So I knew what an incredibly influential role they had. And then, of course, after my father was lost in a plane crash, my mother then served 9 terms in Congress, and then at the age of 81 became the United States ambassador to the Vatican. So I had the model of a very remarkable woman. You know, I had the great honor a couple of years ago of being asked by Betty Ford to be one of the eulogists at her funeral, which would have scared me to death, except she told me exactly what she wanted me to say. And she wanted me to talk about that time, that when my father was majority leader and her husband was minority leader, that they were very, very good friends. That's gone. And part of the reason that's gone is that the families are not there and don't have just the normal intercourse where you would be, you know, at PTA meetings together or at the church together, you know, running into each other at the cleaner. So it is very hard to have that kind of connection. There are few organizations that do it. There's something called the Congressional Club that was established as a wives club. It's now spouses, but you don't often see a man there. And they try very hard to do it. There's some charities that do it. But the truth is now where you see that kind of ameliorating presence is among the women in office themselves. So particularly the women of the Senate have very consciously come together and get together regularly. I always joke with them that they just want to be in a testosterone-free zone, and they do admit that's true, but they also say they get a great deal done. And they are really the only little bastion of bipartisanship in the Congress these days, is among the women.
But now we have two women presidential candidates of some note. One who Hillary Clinton certainly still seems to be the most likely Democratic nominee, but Carly Fiorina can't be dismissed in the unpredictable Republican side of things. But how do these two women in high-profile roles in our politics today? Where do gender politics shape the reception to who they are?
I do think that Hillary Clinton learned in 2008 when she felt that it was very important for her as the first really serious female candidate for president, that she show how tough she was and that she, you know, could answer the red phone in the middle of the night and all of that. This time around, it's a very different campaign. And one of the things she's doing is running as a grandmother. And I personally think that's a very smart thing for her to do because, you know, what is a grandmother? Wise. And so I say as a grandmother, but I think that she conveys all kinds of things by that. A softness, yes, but also a concern for the future, and experience with the past. And I think that is a very different way of running than she did before. Of course, she wasn't a grandmother before either.
And then Carly Fiorina, who is there a risk for her in being so testosterone charged at times?
Well, she tamps it down and does say some very affecting things about having buried a child and all of that, and having, and she does, secretary to CEO and that whole, series of sort of painting herself as a picture of herself as someone who struggled up. She's gotten a certain amount of pushback on that, but candidates get pushback. That's what happens when you run for office. But I think that what she did in that debate, where she knew everything, was just sort of show that there was somebody on that stage who actually knew everything, and it was doubtful for a while there.
As you described your own mother and the plethora of things that she was managing, and then the roles that she took on, there's always a current debate about the limits on women in the workplace. And so now we've got Sheryl Sandberg and Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Don't start. It's just, I mean, it makes me nuts. These rich women who have every choice available to them, having this argument among themselves. It is not, 99.9% of the population cannot afford to have this conversation. Women work because the same reason men work, they have to. And yes, there's some women who also enjoy it, just like some men also enjoy it. But the notion that we're having this conversation just obviously makes me mad. Now, you want to have a conversation about what we need to do in order to make the whole society more equal and more competitive internationally. We need to make the workplace far more caretaker friendly. And that doesn't just mean for children, for mothers of children, it means for people taking care of parents, people taking care of friends, people taking care of the community. And when we have the majority of our college graduates being female and 2/3 of our graduate school graduates being female, if the workplace is not someplace that they can be productive and able to do their best work, then we will not be competitive as a nation.
All of that's interesting to me as well in the context of the book. At the end of it, you have an epilogue in which you wrap up the stories of a good many of these different characters. Some of them go on to these quite remarkable things like leadership in the suffragette movement, but also a lot of the women in particular, because typically their husbands die before them, and it's a pre-Social Security world, and a number of them end up in poverty. Desperate poverty. Elizabeth Keckley, the Mary Lincoln's dressmaker, who now is a more familiar figure to people because of the Lincoln film.
Well, of course, she had the double whammy of racism and sexism. She was really a designer. She was a couturier and considered a great artist in her time. And she ran a shop. She had many people working for her. So to end up in poverty was quite a surprising thing in a way. But on the other hand, part of the reason for that was her friendship with Mary Lincoln, and then writing the tell-all book, which, some things never change, and that really put her in disgrace with a lot of people.
So in the end, the story that you tell in the book is one that is both about this tremendous opening of opportunity for women in this period of great stress for the nation, some of whom benefit tremendously from that great opening, some of whom don't, and also some of the advances that you describe. Some are ones that also, the window seems to close on some of these for a fairly long time before Rosie the Riveter and some other folks come along and create another version of it.
I don't think the window ever completely closes. I think that what happens is that you have periods where it seems to shut a little bit, and a lot of that has to do with whatever the economy is at whatever period of time you're in. But once it's open some, it continues, it never shuts back to where it was. And that's what we see in each one of these periods, is that these very brave and inspiring women continue to keep pushing that window open even when people try to close it.
Thanks for being here. Cokie Roberts, the book is Capital Dames, The Civil War and the Women of Washington. We hope you'll join the conversation with American Forum and our guest by following us on Twitter and Facebook at #CapitalDames. To send us a comment about this program or download podcasts or transcripts, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next week.